At the heart of ancient Greece, where narrow paths connected distant city-states and traders crossed dusty thresholds into sanctuaries, one site became unlike any other. Delphi was not merely visited, it was approached. Stone by stone, it had grown from a cluster of springs and groves into a place where questions were carried across days of travel and left in the hands of those who listened. Temples rose beside fountains that never ran dry, and incense drifted through marble porticos, while citizens, generals, and kings waited their turn. What began as local ritual would soon shape law, war, and belief across a civilization. High on the southern slopes of Mount Parnassus, where winter winds carved deep ravines through limestone cliffs and spring waters bubbled from hidden sources, the very ground seemed to pulse with life. Ancient peoples walking these treacherous paths felt it first in their bones, a subtle trembling beneath their feet, a whisper of something vast and unknowable stirring in the depths below. Strange emanations rose from cracks in the bedrock, carrying scents that reminded observers of flowers blooming nowhere in the known world. Shepherds driving their flocks through mountain passes found themselves inexplicably drawn to this particular slope. Travelers crossing from northern territories to southern plains discovered their feet, carrying them toward these heights, as if invisible threads pulled them upward through pine-scented air. Something dwelled here that demanded acknowledgement, something older than human memory, yet intimately connected to every breath they drew. Long before any temple crowned these heights, before any priestess spoke celestial words, or any king sought heavenly guidance, this landscape belonged entirely to Gaia. Her presence permeated every grain of soil, every drop of dew that gathered on wild laurel leaves, every crack in limestone where strange emanations escaped to meet morning light. She was not merely goddess of this place, she was the place itself, living consciousness that animated stone and stream and sky. Gaia's domain extended far beyond what mortal eyes could perceive. Her influence flowed through underground rivers connecting distant springs, traveled along fault lines splitting continents, whispered through caves, honeycombing the mountain's heart. When she stirred in deep slumber, earthquakes shook cities hundreds of miles away. When she sighed in dreams, volcanic islands emerged from wine-dark seas. This particular mountainside served as her chosen window into the world above, the aperture through which her voice could reach those who walked in sunlight. Wild creatures exhibited behaviors that local inhabitants interpreted as omens. Eagles circling in patterns that seemed deliberate, wolves howling melodies carrying prophetic meaning, serpents gathering in numbers suggesting supernatural purpose. Women experienced vivid dreams while camping near certain springs, visions so compelling they returned repeatedly to sleep on cold stone, hoping to dream again. Spontaneous manifestations gradually attracted more deliberate attention. Families traveling between seasonal settlements began timing their journeys to pass through during favorable periods, bringing small offerings to leave among rocks. Hunters discovered that prayers spoken at specific locations improved their success, while traders learned that agreements sealed with water from particular springs proved more binding than mere words. Castalia's waters emerged from a cleft so narrow that drawing them required careful positioning, yet the quantity seemed limitless. Those who drank from this source reported extraordinary clarity of thought and vivid dreams filled with symbolic meaning. Women who bathed in its pools spoke of visions that later proved accurate, while men who cleansed themselves in its flow claimed enhanced ability to understand animal speech and interpret natural signs. Unlike any other spring in the region, Castalia's waters remained constant in temperature regardless of season. never freezing despite winter's severity, nor growing warm under summer's intensity. Their taste carried mineral traces that seemed to change according to the drinker's condition, bitter to the impure, sweet to the devout, complex beyond description to those granted celestial favor. Most mysteriously, the water's surface sometimes revealed images bearing no relation to the sky above, showing scenes from distant places or future times that careful observation proved accurate. Laurel groves flourishing around these springs became integral to the site's developing significance. These trees grew larger here than anywhere else in Greece, their leaves maintaining unusual silver-green coloration that caught and reflected light in mesmerizing patterns. When winds moved through their branches, resulting sounds resembled human voices speaking unknown languages, creating continuous murmur that visitors interpreted as supernatural communication. Local inhabitants discovered that laurel leaves from these particular trees possessed properties unavailable elsewhere. Burned as incense, they produced smoke, inducing trance states characterized by enhanced perception and insight. Chewed fresh, they generated mild euphoria, accompanied by unusually clear thinking. Woven into wreaths and worn during ceremonial activities, they seemed to facilitate communion with otherworldly powers. Trees themselves appeared to respond to human presence, their rustling intensifying when significant individuals approached, while falling silent during periods of emptiness. Geological phenomena defied easy explanation, even by those who witnessed them daily. Fissures in bedrock released emanations carrying distinctive odors, sometimes sweet like burning honey, other times acrid with mineral intensity, occasionally bearing fragrances reminding observers of flowers blooming nowhere in the known world. These releases varied in intensity according to no predictable pattern, sometimes disappearing entirely for months before returning with unexpected force. More dramatic were occasional displays of underground activity that convinced early observers they stood at a gateway between worlds. Deep rumblings preceded by hours, the appearance of new cracks in stone surfaces, as if vast movements in Earth's depths were gradually manifesting in the visible realm. Springs that had flowed steadily for generations suddenly altered their courses, creating new pools in locations that seemed deliberately chosen for ceremonial purposes. Most remarkably, certain areas of ground remained warm throughout winter, allowing plant growth that should have been impossible at such elevation and latitude. Serpent presence characterized this landscape from its earliest known history in forms transcending ordinary natural phenomena. While snakes certainly inhabited rocky crevices and hidden springs, their numbers and behaviors suggested supernatural influence. They gathered in configurations that seemed intentional, creating patterns around specific locations serving as markers for human visitors. Their seasonal movements followed cycles corresponding to astronomical events rather than purely biological needs. These creatures displayed intelligence that amazed careful observers. They appeared to recognize individual humans, approaching some with evident trust, while avoiding others with unmistakable hostility. They congregated around certain springs during particular lunar phases, creating living sculptures that changed form according to celestial influences. Most significantly, their presence or absence at specific locations provided reliable guidance for determining when and where supernatural communications might be received. Python embodied the culmination of this serpentine presence. Unlike smaller creatures serving as omens and guides, he represented Earth's deepest wisdom and most terrible power. His coils extended through caverns, reaching far below the mountain's visible foundations, while his consciousness encompassed knowledge accumulated across geological ages. When he chose to manifest in the upper world, His appearance transformed the entire character of the precinct. Python's guardianship over Gaia's voice operated according to principles requiring no human intervention or interpretation. Those who approached with pure intentions and legitimate need for celestial guidance found him surprisingly accommodating, his massive presence serving more as protection than obstacle. His intimidating appearance discouraged casual visitors, while his supernatural perception identified individuals whose requests deserved serious consideration. Under his watchful supervision, Earth's spontaneous manifestations achieved remarkable accuracy and consistency. Gaia's communications came through multiple channels simultaneously, emanations inducing visionary states, springs whose babbling carried verbal messages, laurel leaves rustling meaningful patterns, animal behaviors conveying complex information. Skilled interpreters learned to synthesize these various signs into coherent guidance, though the process required patience and sensitivity rather than formal training. Consultations during this primordial period followed natural rhythms rather than artificial schedules. Earth's voice emerged when genuine need coincided with favorable conditions, creating opportunities that could neither be forced nor predicted with certainty. Suppliants learned to approach with offerings appropriate to their circumstances, while remaining prepared to wait days or weeks for meaningful responses. Resulting prophecies possessed organic quality, reflecting deep wisdom of geological time rather than human urgency. Transition from Earth goddess worship to Olympian dominance unfolded gradually across several centuries, driven by cultural changes extending far beyond this single site. New populations moving into central Greece brought different theological concepts, emphasizing sky gods rather than earth deities, masculine authority rather than feminine wisdom, organized priesthoods rather than spontaneous manifestations. These intellectual innovations created pressure for institutions to adapt or face replacement by more contemporary alternatives. Apollo's emergence as a major force reflected broader transformations affecting Greek civilization during late Bronze Age and early Iron Age periods. He embodied qualities appealing to increasingly urban and militaristic societies: rational thought over instinctive wisdom, artistic excellence over natural beauty, predictable order over mysterious spontaneity. His growing popularity among ruling elites created demand for institutions serving political and social functions beyond mere divination. Mythological accounts describing Apollo's conquest preserved memories of actual historical processes, while transforming them into narrative forms suitable for oral transmission. His arrival from northern regions reflected real population movements, bringing new concepts into central Greece. His conflict with Python symbolized genuine tensions between competing theological systems. His establishment of a new institution represented historical changes in how celestial communication was understood and organized. Apollo journeyed to these heights in search of a location suitable for establishing his own shrine. His perception immediately recognized the site's extraordinary natural properties, while his superior power enabled him to overcome whatever obstacles prevented its utilization for his purposes. Confrontation with Python thus became inevitable, not merely territorial dispute, but cosmic struggle between old and new forms of authority. Battle itself transcended ordinary physical conflict, representing instead a clash between fundamentally different approaches to understanding celestial will. Python's massive strength derived from his deep connection to Earth's most ancient powers, enabling him to draw upon energies accumulated across countless millennia. Apollo's superior weapons reflected technological and intellectual innovations, giving sky gods advantages unavailable to their chthonic predecessors. outcome was predetermined by historical currents favoring systematic organization over spontaneous manifestation. Victory established more than simple territorial control over a particularly favorable site. It marked triumph of anthropomorphic deities sharing human characteristics and concerns over natural powers, operating according to principles beyond mortal comprehension. Apollo's willingness to communicate through human intermediaries, using recognizable language patterns, made celestial wisdom more accessible to ordinary suppliants, while his incorporation into Olympian political structures provided sanction for emerging forms of social organization. Establishing Apollo's shrine required fundamental modifications to existing arrangements. Spontaneous manifestations characterizing Gaia's voice needed replacement with more predictable and controllable forms of celestial communication. Serpent guardians protecting the site under the previous regime required elimination or transformation into servants of new authority. Most significantly, informal consultation practices evolved organically over centuries, needed systematization into procedures serving larger numbers of suppliants more efficiently. Pythia emerged as Apollo's chosen spokesperson, representing revolutionary innovation in practice. Unlike informal interpreters who had previously attempted to understand Gaia's various communications, this new priestess received direct inspiration, enabling her to speak with the god's own voice. Her selection and preparation followed specific procedures designed to ensure purity and receptivity to Apollo's influence. Her utterances possessed authority, deriving directly from Olympian sources rather than human interpretation of natural phenomena. Her name commemorated Apollo's victory over the great serpent, while acknowledging continuity between old and new traditions. By adopting terminology referencing the previous regime, the new arrangement demonstrated respect for established customs while asserting superior authority. This careful balance between innovation and tradition enabled Apollo's voice to inherit accumulated prestige of Gaia's ancient shrine, while offering improved services, meeting contemporary needs more effectively. Omphalos stone that Apollo established at the center of his new sanctuary carried profound theological and geographical significance. This marker designated these heights as the center of the world, cosmic axis around which all earthly geography revolved. Its placement at the specific location where celestial communications occurred invested the site with universal rather than merely local importance. Pilgrims approaching from any direction could orient themselves according to this fixed reference point connecting earth to heaven. Stone's origins remained shrouded in mystery, enhancing its authority. Some accounts described it as a meteorite fallen from sky at Apollo's command, while others claimed it marked the spot where two eagles released by Zeus from opposite ends of Earth had met in their flight. Regardless of actual provenance, the omphalos served as tangible symbol of presence anchoring invisible forces operating at the site to physical reality that human visitors could perceive and venerate. Geography developing around the omphalos reflected sophisticated understanding of how physical arrangements could enhance experiences. Temple orientation aligned with astronomical events marking significant points in Apollo's annual cycle, while positioning of auxiliary buildings created processional routes guiding visitors through increasingly hallowed spaces. Integration of natural features, springs, groves, rock formations, with architectural elements produced unified environment where celestial and human realms intersected harmoniously. Dual character emerging during the transitional period acknowledged both continuity with ancient traditions and innovation responding to contemporary needs. Apollo's dominant presence during active season provided systematic guidance that increasingly complex Greek society required, while Dionysus's winter residence honored older patterns of seasonal variation. This theological compromise enabled the new arrangement to serve diverse constituencies without completely alienating supporters of traditional practices. Dionysus's role extended beyond mere seasonal presence to encompass fundamental aspects of the site's continuing character. His association with vegetation cycles, underground powers, and ecstatic experiences maintained connections to chthonic elements that had always characterized this location. His winter dominion allowed for forms of communication differing from Apollo's rational discourse. Dream visions, possession states, mystical experiences transcending ordinary consciousness. This diversity enriched the overall environment while providing alternative approaches when Apollo's methods proved insufficient. Theological framework justifying this dual occupancy drew upon sophisticated concepts about nature and cosmic organization. Apollo and Dionysus represented complementary rather than competing aspects of authority. Rational order balanced by intuitive wisdom, conscious planning balanced by spontaneous inspiration, individual excellence balanced by communal participation. Their alternating presence reflected deeper truths about how celestial powers operated in human affairs, requiring both systematic guidance and periodic renewal through contact with more primordial sources of energy. Practical arrangements enabling this alternation required careful coordination between different priestly groups, serving the two deities according to their specific requirements. Apollo's priests maintained procedures and temple facilities during active season, while Dionysiac devotees assumed responsibility for winter ceremonies, honoring the site's chthonic character. This division of labor prevented conflicts between incompatible practices, while ensuring that the precinct remained active throughout the entire year. Gradual emergence of pan-Hellenic significance transformed this location from regionally important shrine into a center serving Greek communities throughout the Mediterranean world. This expansion reflected both the site's inherent qualities and deliberate efforts by its administrators to attract broader constituencies. Success in providing guidance for major political and military decisions enhanced reputation, while development of capabilities serving large numbers of distant suppliants made such expanded influence practically feasible. Achieving pan-Hellenic status required careful navigation of competing political interests and regional loyalties that might have prevented widespread acceptance of any single authority. Administrators cultivated relationships with influential leaders from various Greek communities, while maintaining studied neutrality in conflicts that might have compromised their universal appeal. Guidance consistently emphasized principles transcending local interests: justice, piety, moderation, respect for celestial will, that could command acceptance across diverse political and cultural contexts. Physical infrastructure developed to accommodate increased visitation reflected sophisticated understanding of how practical arrangements influenced experiences. Expanded temple facilities provided adequate space for major ceremonial events, while maintaining intimate atmosphere necessary for effective communication. Improved roads and harbor facilities enabled pilgrims from distant regions to reach the site more easily, while standardized accommodation and services ensured that visitors from different backgrounds received appropriate treatment according to their status and needs. Economic systems supporting this expanded operation generated resources enabling continued improvements and innovations, while maintaining authenticity, forming the foundation of authority. Offerings from grateful suppliants funded construction projects and supported growing numbers of priests, servants, and craftsmen required for operations. Commercial activities developing around the pilgrimage economy provided income for local communities while creating incentives for maintaining reputation and accessibility. By 800 BC, transformation from Gaia's ancient earth voice to Apollo's Olympian arrangement had reached completion, though traces of earlier tradition remained embedded within new procedures. Fearsome Python lay dead, his massive coils decomposing in the mountain's depths, yet his presence continued to influence the emanations enabling communication. Spontaneous manifestations characterizing the primordial voice had been systematized into regular procedures, yet underlying geological and forces making prophecy possible remained essentially unchanged. Achievement represented more than simple innovation or development. Apollo's establishment marked fundamental transformation in how Greek civilization understood the relationship between celestial and human realms. Accessibility of guidance through systematic procedures made heavenly wisdom available to ordinary mortals in ways previous traditions had never achieved. Reliability of communications provided foundations for political and social planning, enabling more complex forms of community organization. Questions remained about the ultimate source and meaning of phenomena, continuing to manifest at this extraordinary location. Did Apollo truly speak through his chosen priestess? Or did she interpret natural powers, operating according to principles beyond human comprehension? Were the emanations inducing her trance states products of intervention, or geological processes explainable through physical causes? Did accuracy of predictions demonstrate supernatural knowledge or sophisticated understanding of human nature and political probability? Such questions would occupy philosophers and theologians for centuries without reaching definitive resolution. Mystery surrounding capabilities formed an essential component of authority, generating sense of awe and reverence necessary for effective function. Whether celestial or natural in origin, powers operating at this site possess strength, transcending ordinary human understanding, creating opportunities for guidance and wisdom that could not be replicated elsewhere. Foundations had been established for developments that would make this the most influential institution in the Greek world. Apollo's victory over ancient Earth Voice had created groundwork for systematic guidance serving political, military, and personal needs of expanding civilization. Structures emerging during this formative period would prove capable of adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character. The voice, now speaking from Parnassus's heights, would soon shape destinies of kings and commoners, cities and nations across the entire Greek world, where gods had battled for dominion over humanity's future, where ancient serpent wisdom had yielded to Olympian innovation, where Earth's mysterious depths had been harnessed to serve sky god purposes. The greatest voice of the ancient world had begun its remarkable career. The priestess who would soon sit above the chasm, breathing emanations, carrying inspiration, speaking words that would reshape the Mediterranean world, was about to take her place in history. Apollo's age had begun. Where Python's blood had soaked into the limestone, the god commanded his followers to build. Stone by stone, column by column, the first great sanctuary rose above the chasm, where Earth's ancient voice had once spoken through serpent wisdom. Craftsmen from across the Greek world labored to create a structure worthy of housing celestial communication, their chisels ringing against marble that would echo with prophecies for 1,000 years. Bronze smiths forged doors that gleamed like captured sunlight, while sculptors carved pediments depicting the sun god's triumph over chaos. Inside the growing edifice, architects calculated precise acoustics that would carry a priestess's words to waiting petitioners without losing their mysterious power. Every measurement, every angle, every decorative element served dual purposes, honoring the deity while creating an environment where mortal consciousness could touch the infinite. Construction proceeded according to visions the god himself provided, through dreams sent to master builders. Foundation stones were placed during specific lunar phases, while columns were raised only when certain stars achieved favorable positions. Workers discovered that their tools functioned differently within the sacred precinct. Bronze blades stayed sharper, longer. Measuring rods achieved greater precision. Levels revealed truths invisible elsewhere. The building itself seemed eager to exist, cooperating with efforts in ways that convinced skeptics they witnessed authentic miracles. Yet even as the magnificent shrine took form, questions arose about who would serve as the deity's voice. The sun god required a woman intermediary, capable of receiving his words without losing her sanity, someone pure enough to channel celestial wisdom without corrupting its message. After consulting ancient traditions and conducting careful observations, religious authorities established criteria that would govern priestess selection for centuries to come. Originally, only young virgins qualified for consideration. Their unmarried state symbolized dedication exclusively to the sun god, while their youth suggested minds uncluttered by worldly concerns that might interfere with receptivity. Families throughout central Greece began presenting daughters for evaluation, hoping that selection would bring honor to their households, along with the advantages of having a relative in such an influential position. Selection involved tests that evaluated both spiritual sensitivity and psychological stability. Candidates spent days in the sacred precinct, observing their reactions to various stimuli, particular incense blends, specific musical tones, exposure to emanations rising from the chasm. Those who showed appropriate responsiveness without losing their composure advanced to more intensive evaluation, involving dreams, trance states, and direct exposure to celestial influence. Training for accepted candidates required years of preparation, covering both technical skills and mystical development. They learned proper pronunciation of archaic formulations, memorized traditional invocations that opened communication channels, and practiced breath control techniques, enabling them to inhale the potent vapors without immediate collapse. Most challenging was developing the peculiar consciousness that allowed inspiration to flow through their voices, while retaining enough awareness to shape incomprehensible heavenly knowledge into meaningfully expression. Everything changed when a young priestess named Periala lost her virginity to an infatuated petitioner who had convinced her that the god himself commanded their union. Her subsequent prophecies proved wildly inaccurate, while her behavior became increasingly erratic until she had to be removed from service. This scandal forced fundamental reconsideration of selection criteria that had previously seemed divinely mandated. Religious authorities concluded that youth and sexual inexperience, far from being assets, actually created vulnerabilities that sophisticated visitors could exploit. Women with life experience possessed better judgment about nature, while those who had raised families understood the concerns that motivated most requests. Most importantly, mature women proved more resistant to emotional manipulation that might compromise their function. New regulations required that candidates be at least 50 years old and drawn from respected local families with established reputations for wisdom and integrity. These women brought decades of accumulated knowledge about behavior, regional politics, and problem solving that enhanced their ability to provide useful advice even when celestial inspiration proved ambiguous. Their age protected them from romantic entanglements, while their social standing discouraged attempts at bribery or coercion. Peribaya became the first priestess selected under the revised criteria, setting precedents that would govern the position for generations. A widow with grown children, she possessed the dignified bearing and sharp intelligence that authorities decided were more valuable than youthful enthusiasm. Her early prophecies demonstrated remarkable accuracy, combined with wisdom that convinced both petitioners and priests that the new approach represented genuine improvement over previous methods. The selection process evolved into elaborate ceremonies that reinforced both the sacred nature of the position and the democratic principles underlying development. Citizens from throughout the Delphic region could nominate candidates, while final selection involved seeking the deity's approval through divination rituals. This procedure ensured that chosen priestesses possessed both community support and demonstrable celestial favor, legitimizing their authority through consensus and divine approval. Once selected, each new oracle underwent purification rituals lasting an entire month. She bathed daily in Castalia's waters, while observing strict dietary restrictions that prepared her body for the stresses of regular trance states. Priests instructed her in the historical traditions that would inform her prophecies, while older priestesses shared knowledge about managing the psychological challenges of serving as a conduit for supernatural forces. The Aditon, where the oracle received her visions, represented the most carefully designed sacred space in the ancient world. Located directly above the chasm from which inspirational vapors arose, this underground chamber combined natural phenomena with architectural elements, creating an environment that reliably induced appropriate altered states of consciousness. Walls carved from living rock amplified acoustic effects, while hidden ventilation systems regulated the concentration of ascending gases. At the chamber's center stood the sacred tripod, where the priestess positioned herself to receive the god's influence. This bronze seat, supported by legs shaped like serpents honoring the defeated Python, held her directly above the primary source of emanations, while providing stability during the violent reactions that accompanied possession. Nearby, the Omphalos stone served as a focal point for meditation that helped her achieve the precise mental state necessary for accurate prophecy. Laurel branches filled the chamber, their leaves releasing additional psychoactive compounds when heated by burning incense. This carefully orchestrated combination of geological vapors, botanical preparations, and architectural acoustics created conditions that consistently enabled supernatural communication while minimizing risks to the priestess's health and sanity. The entire arrangement reflected centuries of experimentation that had gradually refined the procedures to optimal effectiveness. Procedures developed elaborate complexity that served multiple functions, testing petitioners' sincerity, generating appropriate revenues for operations, and creating psychological conditions that enhanced accuracy. Potential visitors had to demonstrate both genuine need for celestial advice and adequate resources to compensate the shrine for its services. This screening process eliminated frivolous requests while ensuring that serious inquiries received appropriate attention. Petitioners began their approach by observing purification requirements that prepared them spiritually for contact with forces. They bathed in Castalia's waters, abstained from certain foods, and participated in preliminary ceremonies that demonstrated their respect for the god and his institution. These rituals served purposes. They provided time for authorities to investigate the visitors' backgrounds and formulate advice that would address their actual needs rather than their stated requests. Payment for sessions followed complex schedules that reflected both the petitioners' financial capabilities and the perceived difficulty of their requests. Wealthy individuals and powerful states paid substantial fees that helped fund operations, while ordinary citizens could often obtain advice for modest offerings of agricultural products or handcrafted items. This flexible system ensured that wisdom remained accessible to all social classes, while generating sufficient income to maintain the elaborate institutional infrastructure. On designated days, petitioners gathered before dawn in the courtyard, arranging themselves according to carefully observed precedents that reflected both their social status and the urgency of their requests. Representatives of major city-states received priority, followed by wealthy private individuals, then ordinary citizens whose needs had been deemed worthy of attention. This hierarchy reinforced existing social structures while ensuring that important matters received appropriate priority. The oracle's preparation began hours before she encountered any visitors. She fasted completely, consuming only water from Castalia that had been blessed through special ceremonies. Servants burned specific incense blends throughout her chambers, creating atmospheric conditions that gradually induced the receptive mental state necessary for receiving inspiration. Most importantly, she spent extended periods in prayer and meditation that opened her consciousness to the gods' influence. Calendar restrictions limited sessions to specific days that coincided with favorable astronomical conditions and the deity's presence at the site. During the 3 winter months, when Dionysus dominated the precinct, no prophecies were given except in extraordinary circumstances involving threats to civilization itself. Even during active periods, sessions occurred only on the 7th day of each month, creating scarcity that enhanced the perceived value of advice while allowing adequate time for the priestess's recovery between encounters. Weather conditions could further postpone scheduled sessions, as certain atmospheric phenomena interfered with the precise geological processes that generated inspirational vapors. Storms that altered underground pressures, seasonal changes affecting gas concentrations, and seismic activity that modified the Earth's emanations all influenced whether conditions were favorable for authentic prophecy. These natural constraints reinforced the understanding that the god's voice depended on cosmic forces beyond mortal control. When conditions proved favorable and preparations were complete, the oracle descended into the Adyton, while priests led petitioners through final ceremonies that prepared them to receive words. Specific chants opened communication channels, while burning herbs created atmospheric conditions that enhanced both the priestess's receptivity and the visitor's ability to understand cryptic responses. Every element of the procedure had been refined through centuries of experience to maximize the likelihood of meaningful results. Seated on her tripod above the chasm, the oracle breathed deeply of the vapors that carried inspiration. Witnesses described her transformation as the god took possession of her consciousness. Violent trembling, followed by supernatural stillness. Normal voice replaced by sounds that seemed to originate from depths beyond reach. Her eyes rolled back until only whites remained visible, while her hair streamed as if blown by winds that touched no one else in the chamber. The deity's words emerged in forms that required careful interpretation by trained priests who understood both the god's symbolic language and the concerns that motivated requests. Sometimes the oracle spoke in coherent language that addressed questions directly, but more often her utterances took cryptic forms that concealed multiple meanings within apparently simple statements. These ambiguities reflected not imperfection in the process, but sophisticated wisdom that provided advice while preserving freedom to choose how celestial counsel should be applied. The priests who interpreted these words possessed extensive training in linguistics, regional politics, mythology, and psychology that enabled them to extract meaningful advice from even the most obscure pronouncements. They understood that effective prophecy required balancing honesty about likely outcomes with encouragement that would motivate petitioners toward beneficial action. Their interpretations often proved more valuable than the raw material, transforming cryptic utterances into advice that addressed real-world concerns. Recording procedures ensured that important prophecies were preserved for future reference, while protecting the shrine from accusations of inconsistency or error. Scribes maintained detailed archives documenting requests, the oracle's exact words, priestly interpretations, and eventual outcomes that validated or challenged accuracy. These records enabled continuous refinement of interpretive techniques, while providing precedents that responses to similar future requests. Private sessions for powerful individuals or sensitive matters followed modified procedures that provided greater confidentiality while maintaining the essential elements of the process. The oracle might receive these petitioners alone, without witnessing crowds that could spread sensitive information prematurely. Her responses in such cases were often delivered in writing rather than spoken aloud, enabling more precise communication while preventing misunderstandings that could have serious consequences. Verification of fulfillment became crucial for maintaining the shrine's reputation and credibility. Agents throughout the Mediterranean world monitored outcomes of major prophecies, reporting back to Delphi when predictions proved accurate or when changed circumstances revealed new meanings in previously obscure utterances. These feedback mechanisms enabled continuous improvement in techniques, while demonstrating the god's genuine concern for mortal affairs. Failed prophecies required careful analysis to determine whether errors resulted from misinterpretation of words, changed circumstances that invalidated previous advice, or petitioners' failure to follow provided counsel properly. Authorities developed sophisticated explanations for apparent failures that preserved faith in the deity's wisdom while acknowledging the complexities inherent in predicting behavior and developments. The emergence of rival interpretations created challenges that required diplomatic skill and theological sophistication to resolve. Different priests might understand the same utterance in conflicting ways, while petitioners sometimes claimed that their situations had been misunderstood or that advice had been inappropriately applied. Resolution of such disputes involved senior authorities and sometimes required additional sessions with the oracle to clarify the god's intentions. Training programs for interpretive priests evolved into comprehensive educational systems that produced some of the most learned individuals in the world. Students spent years mastering not only religious traditions and techniques, but also geography, history, law, medicine, and natural philosophy. This broad education enabled them to understand the full context of requests, while providing counsel that addressed both spiritual concerns. International reputation grew as foreign delegations began arriving to consult the god about matters affecting their distant homelands. Egyptian priests sought advice about religious reforms, while Lydian merchants requested counsel about commercial ventures that would carry them to unexplored territories. These exotic sessions enhanced Delphi's prestige, while demonstrating that wisdom transcended narrow interests. The Delphic Amphictyony emerged from needs for coordinating the shrine's expanding operations, while managing the complications created by its growing influence. This confederation of neighboring states assumed responsibility for protecting the site, maintaining its independence from any single authority, and ensuring that procedures remained fair and accessible to all legitimate petitioners, regardless of their affiliations. Member states of the Amphictyony contributed both military protection and financial support in exchange for enhanced access to advice and increased influence over policies. This arrangement created a delicate balance between local autonomy and inter-regional cooperation that served as a model for other forms of confederation. representatives from member states met regularly to address administrative issues, resolve disputes, and coordinate responses to external threats. Wars fought to protect Delphic independence demonstrated both the shrine's growing importance and the violent passions that access to the god's voice could generate among competing factions. When aggressive neighbors attempted to seize control of the site or impose their authority over operations, Amphictyonic forces responded with military action that often escalated into broader regional conflicts. These wars established precedents for international intervention to protect religious institutions from manipulation. Economic arrangements supporting operations created incentives for honest administration, while generating resources adequate for maintaining the complex institutional infrastructure. Fixed fees for standard sessions provided predictable income, while voluntary additional offerings from grateful petitioners rewarded accurate advice and encouraged continued support. Commercial activities in the surrounding area generated taxes that supplemented religious revenues, while creating local constituencies with strong interests in maintaining Delphi's prosperity. Quality control measures ensured that services maintained high standards despite growing demand from increasingly diverse constituencies. Senior priests monitored procedures, evaluated interpretive accuracy, and provided additional training when performance standards declined. Regular reviews of the oracle's effectiveness led to retirement of priestesses whose age or health compromised their capabilities, while promising candidates received advanced preparation that maintained continuity of service. Cultural synthesis occurred as the shrine attracted visitors from throughout the Mediterranean world, creating opportunities for intellectual exchange that enriched civilization, while spreading Hellenic influence to distant regions. Foreign petitioners brought knowledge of different religious traditions, scientific discoveries, and artistic techniques that scholars incorporated into their own understanding. Simultaneously, these visitors returned home with ideas about rational inquiry, organization, and artistic expression that influenced development in their native lands. Philosophical implications of prophecy generated debates that would influence intellectual development for centuries. How could free will coexist with foreknowledge of future events? Did accurate prediction require supernatural intervention? Or could careful analysis of present conditions enable natural forecasting of likely outcomes? These questions stimulated systematic thinking about causation, probability, and the relationship between celestial and mortal knowledge that contributed to the emergence of rational philosophy. Psychological effects of serving as oracle created challenges that required ongoing attention from authorities concerned about their priestesses' long-term welfare. The intense stresses of regular trance states took cumulative tolls that sometimes led to premature aging, chronic illness, or psychological instability. Support systems evolved to provide appropriate care for retired priestesses, while helping active ones maintain their health and effectiveness throughout their service periods. Regional variations in practices developed as the shrine adapted its procedures to serve petitioners from different cultural backgrounds, with varying expectations about appropriate religious behavior. Egyptian visitors expected more elaborate ceremonial preparations, while northern barbarians preferred direct communication without complex interpretive layers. These adaptations demonstrated institutional flexibility while maintaining essential elements that preserved the authenticity of experiences. Seasonal rhythms governed not only when sessions could occur, but also the types of advice that proved most accurate during different periods. Spring prophecies often addressed agricultural concerns and colonial ventures. Summer sessions focused on military campaigns and negotiations, while autumn sessions dealt with commercial ventures and diplomatic initiatives. These patterns reflected both considerations about when different activities typically occurred and deeper connections between cosmic cycles and affairs. By 600 BC, the god's voice had achieved recognition throughout the Mediterranean world as the most reliable source of celestial counsel available to mortal petitioners. Kings planned their campaigns according to advice. Colonists chose their destinations based on recommendations, and individuals made life-changing decisions influenced by words spoken from the sacred tripod. The institution that had emerged from the deity's victory over Python had fulfilled its founder's ambitions, establishing itself as an indispensable component of civilization. Yet success itself created new challenges that would test the shrine's ability to maintain its independence and authenticity while serving increasingly powerful and demanding constituencies. As city-states grew more sophisticated in their maneuvering, they sought ways to influence pronouncements to serve their particular interests. The next 2 centuries would determine whether the god's voice could preserve its integrity while navigating the treacherous currents of power politics that were transforming the Mediterranean world. The infrastructure was now complete. Trained priestesses, interpretive priests, procedures, international recognition, protective alliances, and economic support systems that could sustain operations indefinitely. The oracle sat ready above her sacred chasm, breathing emanations that carried inspiration, prepared to speak words that would shape the destiny of nations. The age of power was about to begin. Blood soaked the sacred precinct for the first time since Python's death. Armed warriors from Kira had violated the ancient neutrality, seizing control of the harbor that served pilgrims traveling to seek celestial wisdom. Their crime went beyond mere territorial aggression. They had dared to impose taxes on those seeking the god's voice, treating access to supernatural counsel as a commodity to be regulated by mortal greed. Solon of Athens received word of this sacrilege while wrestling with constitutional reforms that would reshape his city's destiny. The great lawgiver understood immediately that Kira's actions threatened more than the shrine's prosperity. They challenged the fundamental principle that heavenly wisdom should remain accessible to all who approached with genuine reverence. His response would establish precedents governing the relationship between religious authority and secular power for generations to come. The Amphictyonic forces that assembled to punish Kira's transgression represented every major power in central Greece, united by shared outrage at this unprecedented violation. Sparta contributed its disciplined infantry. Athens provided its emerging naval capabilities, while Thessalian cavalry rode south to join the coalition. Never before had the Mediterranean world witnessed such cooperation in defense of religious principles, demonstrating that some values transcended the petty rivalries that typically divided city-states. Cleisthenes of Sicyon commanded the allied forces with a strategic brilliance that would shape military thinking for centuries. Rather than attempting direct assault against Kira's formidable walls, he implemented a campaign of psychological warfare that exploited the attackers' consciousness of their own sacrilege. His soldiers wore laurel wreaths, declaring their service to the sun god, while priests accompanied the army to perform daily ceremonies, emphasizing the celestial sanction for their mission. The siege that followed demonstrated how religious conviction could transform ordinary soldiers into instruments of heavenly justice. Troops who might normally have grown restless during prolonged operations maintained discipline that amazed their commanders, sustained by absolute certainty that they served a cause transcending earthly considerations. Morale remained high, despite hardships that would have broken armies, motivated by mere territorial ambition or commercial gain. Kira's defenders gradually succumbed to despair as they realized the futility of resisting forces blessed by supernatural approval. Desertion rates increased as individual soldiers concluded that continued service amounted to personal participation in sacrilege that would bring retribution upon their families. The city's leaders attempted to negotiate surrender terms, but Cleisthenes insisted that only complete destruction would satisfy the violated god's justice. When Kura's walls finally fell, the victorious allies implemented punishment that shocked the ancient world with its thoroughness. Every building was demolished, every inhabitant killed or enslaved, and the very soil was cursed so that nothing would ever grow there again. This extreme response reflected not bloodthirsty cruelty, but calculated demonstration that interference with religious institutions would provoke consequences beyond the capacity of mortal power to mitigate. The aftermath of Kura's destruction established the shrine's independence on foundations that would endure for 8 centuries. The conquered territory was declared sacred to the god, permanently removing it from secular control while providing the sanctuary with expanded resources and enhanced security. More importantly, the coalition's success demonstrated that religious authority could mobilize military power sufficient to defend itself against any conceivable threat. Pythian Games emerged from the victory celebrations as a permanent institution, rivaling the Olympic competitions in prestige and international participation. Unlike the athletic contests at Olympia, these new games emphasized artistic achievement alongside physical prowess, reflecting the sun god's patronage of music, poetry, and intellectual excellence. Winners received wreaths of sacred laurel rather than olive branches, symbolizing their recognition by the deity whose wisdom guided nations. The quadrennial cycle that governed these competitions created opportunities for diplomatic contact that proved as valuable as the artistic displays themselves. Representatives from distant city-states gathered to witness performances while conducting the negotiations and alliance building that maintained relative stability throughout the Mediterranean world. These peaceful intervals enabled cultural exchange that enriched all participating civilizations, while spreading Hellenic thought to regions that might otherwise have remained isolated from mainstream developments. Overseas ventures represented perhaps the most dramatic application of the shrine's expanding reach over Mediterranean affairs. As population pressures and economic opportunities encouraged exploration beyond traditional boundaries, would-be colonists sought supernatural counsel about where their efforts would find success. The responses they received shaped the geographic distribution of new communities that would define the boundaries of the civilized world for centuries. Battus of Thera arrived at the sanctuary tormented by a speech impediment that had made him a figure of ridicule among his peers. The priestess's words seemed almost mockingly inappropriate. She commanded him to establish a community in distant Libya, where his affliction would be cured through service to the god's expansion plans. His initial reluctance reflected natural skepticism about prophecies that demanded such dramatic life changes, yet subsequent events would validate celestial wisdom in ways that no mortal could have anticipated. The expedition that Battus eventually led to North African shores faced challenges that would have defeated any venture lacking supernatural sanction. Hostile tribes controlled the coastal regions where landing was attempted, while inland territories remained unexplored and potentially dangerous. The colonists' survival during their first critical years depended on counsel that enabled them to avoid disasters, while identifying opportunities that transformed their outpost from desperate refuge into prosperous commercial center. Cyrene's establishment marked the beginning of systematic overseas expansion, guided by prophetic wisdom rather than random exploration. The prosperity that the community achieved validated the priestess's words, while encouraging other potential colonists to seek similar counsel before launching their own ventures. This pattern created a feedback loop that enhanced the sanctuary's reputation while extending its reach throughout the expanding network of distant territories. Syracuse in Sicily emerged from another prophetic directive that demonstrated supernatural understanding of strategic as well as economic factors. Archias of Corinth received instructions to establish his community at a location that would control maritime traffic through the strait separating Sicily from the Italian mainland. The strategic value of this position became apparent only after the city's growth enabled it to dominate commercial relationships throughout the Western Mediterranean. The transformation of these overseas ventures from desperate expeditions into thriving centers of commerce and culture provided tangible evidence of celestial favor that impressed even skeptical observers. Cities founded according to prophetic counsel consistently outperformed those established through purely secular decision-making, demonstrating that supernatural wisdom could enhance practical outcomes as well as spiritual benefits. This success attracted increasing numbers of petitioners seeking help for their own ventures. Tarentum's foundation illustrated how the Shrine's council could resolve complex social problems while advancing the gods' reach into new regions. The Spartans who established this Italian city were Parthenioi, men of mixed parentage, whose ambiguous social status created tensions within Sparta's rigidly stratified society. The priestess's directive to seek new homes overseas provided an honorable solution that removed potential troublemakers, while extending Spartan power into previously unexplored territories. The success of these guided expansion efforts established patterns that would shape exploration and settlement throughout the ancient world. Future expeditions routinely sought prophetic approval before departure, while established cities maintained ongoing relationships with the sanctuary that provided continuing counsel about expansion, trade relationships, and responses to local challenges. This network of religiously sanctioned outposts created informal alliances that enhanced the security and prosperity of all participants. Athenian democracy found its early direction significantly shaped by prophetic counsel that helped resolve constitutional crises threatening the city's stability. When Solon was appointed to reform laws that favored aristocratic interests at the expense of ordinary citizens, he sought supernatural help about how radical changes could be implemented without provoking civil war. The wisdom he received enabled him to craft compromises that satisfied competing factions, while establishing principles that would guide democratic development for generations. The priestess's response to Solon's inquiries emphasized moderation and balance as essential foundations for just governance. Rather than advocating wholesale revolution that would destroy existing institutions, celestial wisdom recommended gradual reforms that preserved valuable traditions while eliminating abuses that had generated popular discontent. This approach enabled Athens to transform its governmental structure without experiencing the violent upheavals that typically accompanied such fundamental changes. Cleisthenes later returned to the sanctuary when his own democratic innovations faced resistance from conservative factions, opposed to further expansion of popular participation in governance. The priestess's support for his tribal reorganization provided religious sanction that helped overcome opposition while establishing precedents for future constitutional development. Supernatural approval legitimized democratic principles that might otherwise have been dismissed as dangerous innovations threatening social stability. Spartan constitutional development similarly benefited from prophetic counsel that helped balance competing claims between kings, ephors, and popular assemblies. The Shrine's recognition of the Great Retra as divinely approved legislation provided stability that enabled Sparta's unique governmental system to function effectively, despite internal tensions that might otherwise have provoked constant conflict. This celestial sanction helped establish Sparta as a major power capable of projecting authority throughout the Peloponnese. The emergence of tyranny in various city-states created new challenges for the sanctuary's administrators, who had to navigate carefully between supporting legitimate authority and condemning abuses of power. Cypselus of Corinth received prophetic support for his overthrow of the Bacchiad oligarchy, but this approval came with warnings about the consequences of excessive harshness toward former opponents. This nuanced counsel reflected supernatural understanding that changes required both decisive action and subsequent moderation to achieve lasting stability. Periander's consultation about succession arrangements demonstrated how the priestess could provide practical wisdom about maintaining family dynasties while warning against policies that would ultimately prove self-destructive. The counsel he received about governing through fear rather than love proved prophetic when his harsh methods generated the popular resistance that eventually ended tyrannical rule in Corinth. These experiences established the sanctuary's reputation for honest words that addressed long-term consequences rather than immediate advantages. Interstate warfare increasingly involved prophetic consultation as city-states sought supernatural approval for their military ventures while attempting to determine enemy intentions through interpretation of signs and omens. The priestess's responses to such inquiries required extraordinary diplomatic skill, as excessive favoritism toward particular factions could undermine the shrine's credibility, while complete neutrality might appear to indicate celestial indifference to justice and morality. The first Sacred War's resolution had established precedents for military intervention to protect religious interests, but subsequent conflicts tested whether these principles could be applied consistently without transforming the sanctuary into a partisan actor in secular disputes. When Sparta and Athens competed for control over central affairs, both sides sought prophetic support while attempting to interpret statements in ways that favored their particular positions. Commercial relationships throughout the Mediterranean world increasingly reflected patterns established through prophetic counsel about trade routes, market opportunities, and diplomatic arrangements. Merchants who followed celestial recommendations about timing their ventures and selecting their destinations consistently achieved better results than those who relied solely on secular analysis of market conditions. This success encouraged broader acceptance of religious consultation in commercial decision-making. Lydian wealth flowing into the sanctuary's treasuries reflected both gratitude for successful ventures, guided by prophetic wisdom, and attempts to secure continued favor through magnificent offerings. Croesus became legendary for the extravagance of his donations, yet his generosity reflected genuine appreciation for counsel that had enabled him to consolidate control over Anatolia's rich commercial networks. The golden objects he contributed enhanced the shrine's prestige, while demonstrating the practical value of supernatural consultation. Egyptian pharaohs similarly sought prophetic counsel about foreign policy initiatives that might affect their relationships with Mediterranean powers. Amasis II's consultations about defensive alliances against Persian expansion reflected growing recognition that the sanctuary possessed superior understanding of international developments that could determine the survival of ancient kingdoms. These contacts enhanced the shrine's reputation while providing access to exotic goods and foreign wisdom. Persian expansion into territories created unprecedented challenges for the sanctuary's administrators, who found themselves caught between obligations to provide honest counsel and practical pressures to encourage resistance against foreign domination. The responses given to various city-states about Persian intentions had to balance accuracy about likely outcomes with encouragement that would motivate effective defensive preparations. Religious diplomacy during this period demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how spiritual authority could shape secular developments without becoming directly involved in military activities. The priestess's warnings about Persian capabilities provided valuable intelligence that helped city-states prepare for coming conflicts, while her emphasis on unity and cooperation encouraged the unprecedented collaboration that would prove essential for successful resistance. The sanctuary's growing wealth attracted increasing attention from rulers who recognized that control over such resources could significantly enhance their own power and reach. Persian agents attempted to establish relationships with key priests while offering magnificent donations designed to secure favorable treatment for their master's interests. These overtures tested the integrity of religious personnel who had to balance financial considerations against their obligations to provide honest supernatural counsel. Defensive preparations undertaken by the Amphictyonic states reflected growing awareness that the shrine's independence would be threatened by any successful Persian conquest of central Greece. Enhanced fortifications around the sacred precinct, agreements for mutual military assistance, and stockpiling of supplies for potential sieges all demonstrated the determination to preserve religious freedom regardless of the military costs involved. Cultural tensions between traditional values and Persian administrative practices created additional complications for the sanctuary's role in guiding resistance efforts. While supernatural wisdom clearly opposed foreign domination, the methods required for effective defense sometimes conflicted with religious principles, emphasizing moderation and respect for traditional limitations on governmental authority. These contradictions required careful theological analysis to resolve. By 480 BC, the sanctuary had established itself as the most powerful religious institution in the Mediterranean world, with a network of relationships extending from the Black Sea to North Africa and from Sicily to Anatolia. Kings and commoners alike sought its counsel for ventures, ranging from personal marriage decisions to international military campaigns. The responses they received shaped individual destinies, while determining the broader patterns of Mediterranean development. Yet this very success had created vulnerabilities that would soon be tested by the greatest external threat the world had ever faced. Persian military preparations clearly indicated intentions to incorporate all territories into an empire that would stretch from India to the Atlantic Ocean. The sanctuary's response to this challenge would determine not only its own survival, but the future of the civilization it had helped create and guide. The greatest test was approaching. Persian ships darkened the horizon, while enemy armies massed on the frontiers of the known world. The voice that had guided colonists to distant shores, counseled lawmakers about constitutional reforms, and helped merchants find profitable ventures would soon face questions about the survival of everything it had helped build. The age of existential crisis was about to begin. Terror gripped the Mediterranean world as envoys from the Great King arrived demanding earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission to imperial authority. City after city faced the impossible choice between resistance that promised destruction and surrender that meant the end of everything their ancestors had built. Yet when the messengers reached the sacred precinct on Parnassus's slopes, they encountered something unprecedented in their master's expanding empire, a power that acknowledged no earthly sovereign. The priestess who received these foreign demands spoke with a voice that had guided nations for 2 centuries. Her response carried weight that no mere mortal authority could command, while her words would echo through history as the moment when East met West in spiritual as well as military confrontation. What emerged from her lips that day would determine whether the flame of freedom could survive the approaching storm. Xerxes himself had consulted various seers and magicians throughout his vast domains, seeking assurance that his grand expedition would succeed in adding Europe to his already enormous realm. The responses he received from fire priests and Babylonian astrologers consistently promised triumph, while Egyptian prophets foresaw the pharaoh's humiliation before the King of Kings. Only one voice in the known world possessed sufficient authority to challenge these encouraging predictions. Athens faced the most agonizing decision in its brief democratic history. The silver mines at Laurium had recently yielded an unprecedented windfall that could fund either a massive naval construction program or immediate distribution to citizens who desperately needed the money. Themistocles argued passionately for ships, while his rivals demanded that the wealth be shared among the people according to democratic principles. The deadlock threatened to paralyze the city at the moment when decisive action was most crucial. The delegation that climbed Parnassus's sacred paths carried the hopes and fears of an entire civilization. Led by Aristides the Just, it included representatives from every major family and faction within Athenian society. These men understood that the words they would hear might seal their city's fate, yet they also knew that no important decision could be made without celestial sanction. Their question was simple but profound. How could Athens survive the approaching storm? The priestess's response sent shockwaves through the assembled suppliants. She spoke of wooden walls that would save the city, of salamis where triumph awaited, and of countless enemy dead floating in wine-dark waters. Her words suggested that salvation lay not in mighty fortifications or powerful armies, but in trusting to elements that most military minds would consider secondary to traditional forms of defense. Themistocles seized upon this cryptic prophecy with the insight that would earn him recognition as one of history's greatest strategic minds. While others debated whether wooden walls referred to the ancient fortifications on the Acropolis or some metaphorical protection, he understood immediately that the priestess spoke of ships. The naval program he had advocated received instant divine sanction that overwhelmed all opposition. The construction effort that followed transformed Athens into a hive of activity that amazed foreign observers. Shipwrights worked day and night to complete vessels according to specifications that emphasized speed and maneuverability over the massive size that characterized traditional warships. These triremes represented the cutting edge of naval technology, capable of ramming enemy vessels while avoiding retaliation through superior mobility. Sparta's consultation revealed different challenges that required different solutions. The warrior state that had dominated Peloponnesian affairs for generations found itself facing an enemy whose numbers exceeded anything in previous experience. Traditional Spartan tactics emphasized individual excellence and disciplined formation fighting, but these advantages might prove insufficient against the vast hordes that imperial agents reported were marching toward Hellas. King Leonidas received counsel that would become legendary for its tragic nobility. The priestess informed him that either Sparta must fall or one of its kings must die in battle against the invaders. This stark choice reflected the cosmic significance of the approaching conflict. Freedom's survival required sacrifices that transcended normal calculations of military advantage or political benefit. The response given to Leonidas demonstrated how prophecy could transform military necessity into spiritual mission. What might have been merely another border skirmish became instead a sacred duty that justified any sacrifice. The 300 warriors who would accompany their king to Thermopylae understood that they marched not just to battle, but to martyrdom that would inspire resistance throughout the Mediterranean world. Enemy agents attempted to subvert these prophecies through bribery and intimidation that revealed their masters' fundamental misunderstanding of how spiritual authority functioned. The gold they offered to corrupt interpretations was rejected with contempt, while threats against the holy precinct's safety only strengthened resolve to resist foreign domination. These crude attempts at manipulation demonstrated that imperial power, however vast, could not comprehend forces that operated beyond material considerations. The advance guard of enemy scouts who reached central Greece reported strange phenomena that their commanders struggled to interpret. Local inhabitants spoke of supernatural defenders who would protect the sacred sites from violation, while the very landscape seemed to resist foreign presence through unseasonable weather and inexplicable difficulties. These reports generated unease among troops who had conquered the known world, but had never before encountered territory defended by gods. As enemy forces approached Thermopylae, the priestess experienced visions that revealed the cosmic dimensions of the struggle about to unfold. She saw eagles and serpents locked in aerial combat that mirrored the earthly battle between freedom and tyranny, while the gods themselves chose sides in a conflict whose outcome would determine the future of human civilization. These visions reinforced her understanding that resistance was not merely political necessity, but spiritual obligation. The battle at Thermopylae unfolded exactly as the prophecy had foretold, though the participants could hardly have imagined the heroic grandeur that would surround their sacrifice. Leonidas and his men fought with desperate courage that transformed military defeat into moral triumph, demonstrating that some values were worth more than life itself. Their deaths created a legend that would inspire resistance fighters for millennia to come. News of Thermopylae's fall reached the holy precinct as enemy forces advanced towards central Greece, apparently unstoppable in their methodical conquest of every obstacle. Yet the priestess remained calm in the face of approaching catastrophe, sustained by visions that revealed ultimate triumph despite immediate disasters. Her confidence mystified those who could see only the overwhelming material advantages that the invaders possessed. The enemy advance towards sacred Parnassus triggered the most dramatic demonstration of supernatural protection in recorded history. Xerxes himself led the elite immortals in an assault designed to capture the priestess and compel her to prophesy his ultimate success. What occurred next became legendary throughout the ancient world, though skeptics would debate its literal accuracy for centuries. Massive boulders broke loose from the mountainside as the invaders climbed the sacred paths, crushing hundreds of soldiers in an avalanche that seemed too precisely timed to be merely natural. Lightning struck repeatedly from clear skies, while the earth itself trembled with violent earthquakes that opened chasms swallowing entire companies of troops. Most terrifying of all, gigantic figures appeared on the peaks above, supernatural warriors whose bronze armor gleamed with celestial fire. The phantom hoplites who materialized to defend the shrine demonstrated powers that no mortal soldiers could match. Their spears never missed their targets, their shields deflected every arrow, and their war cries echoed with voices that seemed to come from the underworld itself. Enemy troops, veterans of countless campaigns across 3 continents, fled in panic from opponents who appeared and vanished like mist, while dealing very real death to any who approached the sacred precinct. Xerxes himself witnessed these supernatural defenders with his own eyes, though he would later claim that local trickery, rather than divine intervention, had created the illusions that saved the holy site. His rapid withdrawal from the mountain demonstrated that even the King of Kings recognized forces beyond his comprehension, while his failure to capture the priestess deprived him of the propaganda coup that might have convinced Hellenes that resistance was futile. The naval battle at Salamis fulfilled the prophecy in ways that amazed even those who had received the original prediction. Themistocles deployed his fleet according to tactical principles that seemed to ignore conventional wisdom about naval warfare. Yet every movement proved perfectly calculated to exploit enemy weaknesses while maximizing Athenian advantages. The narrow waters that might have disadvantaged the smaller force instead became a trap that prevented enemy numbers from achieving decisive effect. The destruction of Xerxes' fleet vindicated divine wisdom in spectacular fashion, while demonstrating that mortal leaders could achieve miraculous results when they aligned their strategies with celestial counsel. Ships that should have been outmatched by larger vessels instead rammed their enemies with devastating precision, while crews fought with supernatural endurance that enabled them to continue fighting long after normal human limits would have been exceeded. Surviving invaders fleeing from Salamis carried tales of warriors who seemed immune to normal weapons, while wielding supernatural strength that enabled impossible feats of combat effectiveness. These reports spread throughout the enemy camp, generating demoralization that proved as destructive as the actual battlefield losses. The psychological impact of apparent divine intervention multiplied the material consequences of military defeat. The aftermath of enemy withdrawal triggered an unprecedented wave of gratitude that transformed the holy precinct into a treasure house, rivaling the wealthiest palaces in the known world. Offerings poured in from every city that had resisted the invasion, while even neutral states contributed magnificent donations expressing relief that the threat to independence had been eliminated. These gifts demonstrated both appreciation for prophetic accuracy and recognition of the shrine's role in organizing effective resistance. Athens commissioned a monument commemorating the wooden walls prophecy that had saved the city from destruction. This elaborate sculptural group depicted Themistocles receiving divine inspiration while ships under construction rose behind him, celebrating both human wisdom and celestial guidance that had made triumph possible. The inscription praised the priestess whose words had provided the key to naval supremacy. Sparta's offering honored Leonidas and his 300 with a monument that would become one of the ancient world's most famous works of art. The bronze figures captured the heroic moment when the king received his final prophecy, showing him ready to embrace death in service of freedom's cause. This memorial established precedents for commemorating military sacrifice that would influence artistic expression throughout the classical period. The Delphic Amphictyony reorganized itself to accommodate the new political realities created by enemy defeat and Hellenic unity. Member states that had remained neutral during the crisis faced pressure to demonstrate their commitment to collective defense, while those who had distinguished themselves in battle received enhanced status reflecting their contributions to freedom's preservation. These adjustments strengthened the Confederation while providing frameworks for future cooperation. Treasury construction reached unprecedented levels as triumphant city-states competed to express their gratitude through magnificent architectural monuments. The Athenian treasury became a masterpiece of classical design that showcased the artistic achievements made possible by democratic freedom, while the Syracusan treasury celebrated the role of colonial cities in the common struggle. These buildings transformed the sacred precinct into a museum of Hellenic achievement. Commercial activity flourished as the invasion threat's elimination opened trade routes that had been disrupted during the crisis. Merchants who had followed divine counsel about protecting their assets during the conflict found themselves positioned to profit enormously from the post-war recovery, while those who had ignored prophetic warnings suffered losses that sometimes ruined their enterprises entirely. These outcomes reinforced faith in the practical value of celestial guidance. Artistic patronage expanded dramatically as wealthy individuals sought to express their relief and gratitude through magnificent dedications that would preserve their names for posterity. Sculptors and architects from throughout the Mediterranean world converged on the holy site to create works that would set new standards for beauty and technical excellence. This artistic flowering demonstrated how religious devotion could stimulate creative achievement. The war's conclusion established the shrine's reputation for prophetic accuracy on a scale that impressed the entire known world. Foreign embassies arrived from distant kingdoms seeking guidance about their own challenges, while merchants, generals, and rulers throughout the Mediterranean regarded consultation as essential preparation for any major undertaking. This international recognition enhanced both prestige and practical power, yet triumph itself created new complications that tested the holy precinct's ability to maintain neutrality while serving increasingly competitive constituencies. Athens and Sparta had cooperated magnificently during the crisis, but their alliance began fragmenting as soon as the external threat was eliminated. Both powers sought prophetic support for their conflicting claims about post-war leadership, creating diplomatic challenges that required extraordinary skill to navigate successfully. The Delian League that Athens organized to continue the war against enemy remnants gradually evolved into an empire that dominated Aegean affairs through a combination of naval power and economic pressure. Athenian requests for divine sanction of this imperial project forced the shrine to balance support for legitimate security concerns against condemnation of excessive ambition that might recreate the very tyranny they had fought to resist. Spartan concerns about Athenian expansion led to their own consultations seeking guidance about how traditional Peloponnesian leadership could be preserved without provoking conflicts that might destroy the unity that had saved Hellas. The responses they received emphasized moderation and patience, while warning against preemptive actions that might transform defensive concerns into aggressive policies that would ultimately prove self-destructive. The emergence of new generation leaders who had not participated in the resistance created additional complications for maintaining the consensus that had enabled triumph. Young politicians like Pericles and Cimon possessed different perspectives about destiny that sometimes conflicted with the conservative caution that had characterized earlier prophetic counsel. Their consultations revealed growing tensions between traditional wisdom and innovative ambitions. Cultural achievements that flourished in the post-war environment reflected growing confidence in intellectual capabilities, while creating new challenges for religious authorities who had to address questions about the relationship between human reason and divine wisdom. Philosophers like Anaxagoras and Empedocles proposed natural explanations for phenomena that had previously been attributed to supernatural intervention, forcing theological discussions about the proper boundaries between faith and rational inquiry. By 450 BC, the shrine had achieved heights of wealth, prestige, and international recognition that would have seemed impossible during the dark days when invasion threatened extinction. The prophecies that had guided resistance efforts had been vindicated spectacularly, while the grateful offerings that followed triumph had created resources adequate for maintaining operations on unprecedented scales. Yet beneath this apparent success, new tensions were developing that would test the institution's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The generation that had experienced invasion was gradually being replaced by leaders who took independence for granted, while pursuing ambitious projects that sometimes conflicted with traditional limitations on political ambition. The next half-century would determine whether the wisdom that had saved freedom could provide guidance for using that freedom constructively. or whether success itself would generate the conflicts that had destroyed previous civilizations. The stage was set for the greatest internal struggle in history, a civil war that would test every lesson learned during the crisis, while determining whether the unity that had preserved freedom could survive the peace that freedom had made possible. The priestess who had guided resistance against foreign tyranny would soon face even more difficult questions about preventing domestic tyranny from destroying everything that triumph had achieved. Blood of brothers stained the Aegean as Athens and Sparta tore apart the unity that had saved civilization from Eastern tyranny. What began as disputes over tribute and alliance obligations escalated into a war that consumed an entire generation, leaving the victors nearly as exhausted as the vanquished. When Spartan ships finally sailed into Piraeus harbor in 404 BC, they brought not just military triumph, but the collapse of the world order that had emerged from the glorious resistance against Xerxes. Lysander's harsh peace terms revealed how completely the Peloponnesian conflict had transformed the character of interstate relations. Democratic institutions that had made Athens great were dismantled, replaced by an oligarchy of 30 men whose primary qualification was their willingness to serve Spartan interests. Long walls that had protected Athenian commerce were torn down to the sound of flutes, symbolically ending the naval dominance that had once ruled the eastern Mediterranean. Yet even as traditional powers exhausted themselves in fratricidal struggle, new forces were stirring in the northern mountains that would reshape the entire ancient world. Philip II of Macedon watched the southern city-states destroy each other, while he quietly built the most formidable military machine that Europe had ever seen. His innovations in tactics, logistics, and siege warfare would soon make the hoplite phalanxes that had dominated warfare for centuries seem as obsolete as bronze weapons. Sacred war erupted in 356 BC, providing Philip with the opportunity he had been seeking to intervene decisively in southern affairs. When the Phocians seized control of the holy precinct and began melting down sacred offerings to pay their mercenary armies, they committed sacrilege that demanded punishment from any power claiming to defend religious principle. Philip's response demonstrated both his military capabilities and his sophisticated understanding of how religious authority could legitimize political ambition. Methoni's siege during this conflict cost Philip his right eye, but gained him something far more valuable: a reputation for unstoppable determination that would demoralize enemies before battles even began. His willingness to accept personal injury while pressing an assault sent unmistakable messages about the lengths to which he would go to achieve his objectives. This psychological advantage would prove as important as his tactical innovations in the campaigns that followed. Demosthenes recognized the northern threat with a clarity that eluded most of his contemporaries. His Philippics, delivered in the Athenian assembly with passionate eloquence, warned that Philip's interventions in southern affairs represented not temporary expedients, but systematic preparation for conquest. Yet his calls for renewed resistance fell largely on deaf ears among citizens who had grown weary of constant warfare and suspicious of ambitious politicians seeking to drag them into new conflicts. Receiving Philip's embassy in 346 BC, the priestess faced one of the most delicate diplomatic challenges in the holy site's history. Northern king sought divine sanction for his role as protector of the sacred precinct, while simultaneously making clear that opposition to his authority would bring consequences that no religious institution could survive. Her response required balancing acknowledgement of his legitimate claims against preservation of the independence that had enabled the sanctuary to serve all peoples fairly. Philip's triumph at Chaeronea in 338 BC eliminated the last effective resistance to northern hegemony, while demonstrating tactical innovations that would influence military thinking for centuries. His coordination of infantry, cavalry, and light troops achieved a level of battlefield integration that overwhelmed enemies still fighting according to traditional methods. More importantly, his treatment of the defeated powers revealed strategic vision that extended far beyond mere conquest. League of Corinth, that Philip established after his triumph, represented a masterpiece of political organization that preserved the forms of independence while ensuring northern control over all significant decisions. Member states retained their internal autonomy and traditional institutions, but foreign policy was directed by a hegemon whose authority derived from demonstrated military superiority rather than ancient custom or religious sanction. Young Prince arrived at the sacred site in 336 BC, following his father's assassination, marking the beginning of the most dramatic transformation in human history. Heir who dismounted before the holy precinct bore little resemblance to the conquerors who had previously sought divine approval for their ambitions. His questions revealed plans that transcended anything attempted by previous generations, while his demeanor suggested absolute confidence that celestial favor would support ventures that others might consider impossible. Initially refusing to provide prophecy, the priestess claimed that the day was inauspicious for divine communication. Young King's response revealed the force of personality that would carry him to the ends of the known world. He physically seized her and dragged her toward the sacred chamber, declaring that he would compel the god to speak regardless of conventional restrictions. This unprecedented violation of religious protocol shocked witnesses while demonstrating determination that brooked no obstacles. "You are invincible, my son," declared the priestess as the prince forced her into the sacred chamber. Whether this pronouncement emerged from genuine divine inspiration or desperate attempt to appease an obviously dangerous young man, it provided the confirmation he sought for plans that would reshape 3 continents. He left the sanctuary, convinced that the gods themselves endorsed his intention to surpass every achievement in recorded history. Expedition that the world conqueror launched against the Eastern Empire in 334 BC began as a campaign of revenge for earlier invasions, but evolved into something unprecedented in scope and ambition. His crossing of the Hellespont deliberately echoed mythological precedents that connected his venture to heroic traditions stretching back to the Trojan War. This symbolic framework provided cultural context that enabled his followers to understand their participation in events that transcended ordinary military campaigns. News of early successes reached the holy site through merchant networks that carried information across vast distances with remarkable speed. Destruction of enemy forces at the Granicus River, the capture of Sardis and Ephesus, and the siege of Halicarnassus demonstrated that northern tactical superiority could be projected successfully across the barriers that had previously limited European influence in Asian territories. Tyre's siege revealed engineering capabilities that amazed contemporary observers while establishing patterns that would characterize the young king's approach to apparently impossible challenges. When the island city's position seemed to make conventional assault impossible, his engineers constructed a causeway that permanently connected it to the mainland. This massive project required months of labor and enormous resources, yet its completion demonstrated that determination, combined with technical expertise, could overcome any obstacle. Egypt's submission without resistance provided the conqueror with both enormous wealth and religious legitimacy that enhanced his authority throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Ancient priesthood's recognition of him as pharaoh connected northern power to theological traditions stretching back millennia, while the foundation of his great city created a new center of learning and commerce that would influence intellectual development for centuries. Consulting the oracle of Ammon in the Libyan desert, the young ruler received confirmation of divine parentage that would influence his self-perception for the remainder of his brief but extraordinary life. Whether the priest's declarations reflected genuine supernatural revelation or calculated political accommodation, they reinforced his conviction that he was destined for achievements that transcended normal human limitations. Battles of Issus and Gaugamela demonstrated tactical brilliance that established the world conqueror among history's greatest military commanders, while revealing strategic vision that encompassed not just conquest, but cultural transformation. His defeats of Darius III eliminated organized resistance to northern expansion, while opening territories that had remained closed to European penetration since the dawn of recorded history. Integration of Eastern administrative practices with Northern military organization created governmental systems capable of managing territories spanning 3 continents, while preserving local customs that maintained popular support. King's adoption of Eastern dress and marriage to Asian noblewomen demonstrated understanding that lasting dominion required cultural synthesis rather than simple military occupation. Foundation of cities throughout the conquered territories created permanent bases for Hellenic influence, while providing opportunities for veterans to establish new lives without returning to homelands they had left years earlier. These new settlements served as centers of trade, administration, and cultural exchange that spread Mediterranean civilization to regions that had previously remained isolated from mainstream developments. Death of the great conqueror in Babylon in 323 BC triggered succession struggles that fragmented his empire while preserving the cultural transformations his conquests had initiated. Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from these conflicts inherited administrative techniques, military innovations, and cosmopolitan outlooks that enabled continued expansion of Mediterranean influence throughout the known world. Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt maintained particularly close relationships with the sanctuary, seeking divine guidance for policies affecting their diverse subjects, while contributing magnificent offerings that enhanced the site's prestige. Their patronage of learning created intellectual centers that preserved and transmitted the classical heritage, while fostering new developments in science, mathematics, and philosophy. Seleucid rulers governing vast Asian territories similarly valued celestial counsel about managing populations whose languages, customs, and religious traditions differed radically from those of their northern overlords. Holy sites' responses helped them develop policies that maintained stability while encouraging economic development that benefited both rulers and subjects. Rome's emergence as a major Mediterranean power initially attracted little attention at the sacred precinct, since Italian affairs seemed peripheral to the Eastern conflicts that dominated international politics. Early Roman consultations focused on relatively minor matters: religious reforms, boundary disputes with neighboring cities, and requests for guidance about colonial ventures that seemed modest compared to the great expeditions sponsored by Hellenistic monarchs. Punic wars that erupted between Rome and Carthage gradually revealed the true scope of Roman ambitions, while demonstrating military capabilities that rivaled anything achieved by earlier conquerors. Hannibal's invasion of Italy brought warfare to the heart of the Mediterranean world, on a scale that recalled the Northern Kings' campaigns, while Roman resilience in the face of catastrophic defeats demonstrated national character that impressed even hostile observers. Roman victory in these conflicts established a new pattern of Mediterranean dominance that differed significantly from previous imperial systems. Unlike the Hellenistic kingdoms that had preserved local autonomy while imposing foreign oversight, Roman administration gradually extended citizenship and legal privileges to conquered populations, while requiring adoption of Roman customs and institutions. Systematic conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean during the 2nd and 1st centuries BC brought Roman power into direct contact with the great cultural centers that had preserved and developed the intellectual heritage of classical civilization. Roman generals like Marcellus, Pompey, and Caesar demonstrated appreciation for artistic and scholarly achievements, while ensuring that political control remained firmly in Roman hands. Marcus Crassus's consultation before his ill-fated expedition against the Parthians revealed both Roman ambitions in eastern territories and the sanctuary's continuing relevance to military leaders seeking supernatural sanction for their ventures. Priestess's warning about the dangers he would face proved tragically accurate when his army was destroyed at Carrhae, demonstrating that divine wisdom could still provide valuable guidance when human analysis proved inadequate. Civil wars that destroyed the Roman Republic created opportunities for the Holy Site to demonstrate its diplomatic skills, while navigating conflicts between competing claimants to supreme authority. Pompey, Caesar, and their successors all sought divine support for their causes, while attempting to discredit their rivals' claims to celestial favor. Responses they received required an extraordinary balance between honesty and prudence. Augustus's establishment of imperial government created new opportunities for the sanctuary to serve as a bridge between Roman administrative efficiency and traditional religious practices that remained important to Eastern populations. First emperors' respect for ancient customs, while insisting on political loyalty, provided models that enabled peaceful integration of diverse territories under unified authority. Imperial period brought unprecedented prosperity to the Holy Precinct, as wealthy Romans competed to express their devotion through magnificent offerings, while seeking guidance about personal and political matters. Emperors like Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius demonstrated genuine interest in philosophical questions, while supporting construction projects that enhanced the site's physical beauty and functional capabilities. Plutarch's service as a priest during the late 1st century AD provided detailed insights into how the sanctuary functioned during its final period of genuine authority. His writings preserved descriptions of procedures, interpretive techniques, and administrative arrangements that would otherwise have been lost when traditional practices were eventually abandoned. Growing influence of rational philosophy created intellectual challenges for religious authorities, who had to address questions about the relationship between divine revelation and natural causation. Skeptics like Cicero and Lucian questioned whether phenomena reflected supernatural intervention or psychological and geological factors that could be explained through scientific analysis. Yet even as some intellectuals challenged traditional explanations for accuracy, practical politicians and military commanders continued seeking guidance for ventures where success or failure might determine the fate of nations. Sanctuary's ability to provide useful counsel about complex political and strategic questions ensured its continued relevance despite changing cultural attitudes. By AD 100, the Holy Site had successfully adapted to Roman dominance, while preserving its essential character and continuing to serve constituencies throughout the Mediterranean world. Priestess still sat above the sacred chasm, breathing vapors that carried inspiration, speaking words that influenced individual destinies and political developments. Yet changes were approaching that would test the institution's ability to survive in a world increasingly dominated by new religious movements that challenged traditional relationships between human and divine authority. Classical age was drawing to a close, though few contemporaries recognized the significance of the transformations occurring around them. Next 3 centuries would determine whether institutions that had guided Mediterranean civilization for nearly a millennium could adapt to radically different cultural conditions, or whether they would be swept away by forces they could neither comprehend nor control. Strange new voices were echoing through the Mediterranean world, carrying a message that challenged everything the ancient sanctuaries represented. In distant Palestine, a carpenter's son had claimed to speak with divine wisdom that required no intermediary, no sacred vapors, no elaborate rituals, just devotion to his revolutionary teachings about love, forgiveness, and eternal life. His followers, growing in number despite brutal persecution, proclaimed that the old gods were false idols whose time had ended forever. During Trajan's reign, an elderly oracle first encountered these ideas when a delegation of believers arrived seeking divine counsel about their spreading movement. Paul, a former Pharisee who had traveled throughout the eastern territories, establishing groups of faithful, led this unusual embassy. His request for guidance seemed innocent enough, yet his underlying message struck at the very foundations of ancient practice. "Your God is unknown to us," declared these visitors with unsettling confidence. "He needs no temple made with hands, no golden vessels, no burnt offerings. Most High dwells not in buildings, but in the hearts of those who believe." Such words would have seemed mere blasphemy in earlier times, yet something in their tone suggested conviction that went beyond ordinary spiritual enthusiasm. These people believed they possessed truth that rendered all other spiritual seeking obsolete. Diplomatically neutral, her response acknowledged their sincerity, while noting that many paths led to divine understanding. Yet even this measured reaction failed to satisfy visitors who insisted that their way was the only way, that salvation came through no other name, that the age of multiple gods and competing revelations had ended with their master's resurrection. Their departure left an atmosphere of unease that would only intensify in the decades that followed. Hadrian's personal interest in philosophy and mystery cults brought him to the sacred precinct multiple times during his travels throughout the eastern provinces. This most intellectual of emperors sought answers to questions that went beyond mere political expediency. He wanted to understand the nature of existence, the purpose of human life, and the relationship between mortal consciousness and cosmic order. His conversations with the oracle revealed a mind struggling to reconcile rational inquiry with spiritual longing. Following his beloved Antinous's tragic drowning in the Nile, Hadrian established an elaborate cult that demonstrated both the continuing vitality of ancestral practices and their growing artificiality. This manufactured devotion possessed all the external trappings of authentic divinity, yet lacked the organic development that had characterized genuine movements. Such artificial spiritual creation highlighted how far power had moved from the spontaneous experiences that had originally given birth to the ancient sanctuaries. Marcus Aurelius approached the holy site with the skeptical reverence of a Stoic philosopher who understood the psychological value of rituals while doubting their supernatural efficacy. His meditations revealed a man who found meaning in duty, reason, and acceptance of fate, rather than hope for divine intervention or promises of eternal bliss. When he consulted the oracle, his questions focused on practical matters about governing diverse populations, rather than seeking miraculous solutions to challenges. Devastating the Roman world during Marcus Aurelius's reign, the Antonine Plague created conditions that favored the spread of new spiritual movements throughout the eastern territories. Ancient explanations for mass suffering, divine punishment for human transgressions, cosmic imbalances requiring ritual correction, angry gods demanding increased sacrifices, seemed inadequate to address catastrophes that affected righteous and wicked alike. With indiscriminate ferocity, remarkable organizational capabilities emerged among the new followers during this plague crisis, demonstrating spiritual resources that impressed even hostile observers. Their groups cared for sick members regardless of social status, shared resources with those in need, and faced death with equanimity that reflected genuine conviction about eternal rewards awaiting the faithful. This practical demonstration of transformative power attracted converts who had found ancestral practices unable to provide similar comfort during times of crisis. Rising to power from North African backgrounds, the Severian dynasty brought emperors who possessed different perspectives about spiritual diversity and governmental unity. Septimius Severus and his successors proved more tolerant of exotic cults and foreign traditions than their predecessors. Yet this tolerance was balanced by pragmatic concerns about maintaining order among increasingly diverse populations with conflicting loyalties. Caracalla's extension of citizenship to all free inhabitants inadvertently strengthened the new movement by providing protection against arbitrary persecution while enabling their leaders to travel freely throughout the territories. This unintended consequence of administrative reform accelerated the spread of ideas that would ultimately challenge the spiritual foundations of Roman power. Military disasters, economic collapse, and political chaos characterized the crisis of the 3rd century, creating conditions similar to those that had originally given birth to mystery cults and salvation movements. Ancient civic deities seemed powerless to protect people from barbarian raids, plague outbreaks, and civil wars that devastated entire provinces. Desperate populations sought spiritual alternatives that promised more effective protection and more meaningful explanations for their sufferings. Solar monotheism emerged during this period as an attempt to create unity that could bind together diverse populations without requiring abandonment of all ancestral practices. Worship of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, appealed to military emperors who identified with deities associated with victory and cosmic order, while providing theological frameworks that could accommodate various local traditions within a unified cult. Aurelian's restoration of political stability temporarily revived ancient practices, while demonstrating that Rome still possessed sufficient strength to suppress challenges to established order. His dedication of a magnificent temple to Sol Invictus in the capital symbolized attempts to create new forms of unity that preserved essential elements of classical civilization while adapting to changed conditions throughout the Mediterranean world. Beneath this apparent revival, however, fundamental changes were occurring that would prove irreversible. New spiritual movements had used the crisis period to establish deeper roots in urban populations, while developing institutional structures capable of surviving persecution and providing alternatives to civic organizations. Their bishops had become recognized leaders whose influence often exceeded that of officials in matters affecting daily life. Diocletian's accession brought systematic administrative reforms that addressed many problems that had nearly destroyed Roman control during the previous century. His division of responsibilities among multiple rulers, reorganization of provincial boundaries, and standardization of taxation created governmental structures capable of managing enormous size and complexity more effectively than previous arrangements had achieved. Launching in 303 AD, Diocletian's Great Persecution represented the most systematic attempt ever made to eliminate the new movement from the Roman world. Unlike earlier sporadic outbreaks of violence against individual groups, this coordinated campaign aimed at destroying the organizational infrastructure that had enabled expansion throughout the Eastern territories. Churches were demolished, scriptures confiscated, clergy imprisoned, and ordinary believers forced to choose between apostasy and death. revealing how completely ancient institutions had become subordinated to state power. The sacred site's response to this policy offered no protest against persecution of the followers, no defense of spiritual freedom, no assertion that divine will operated independently of governmental decree. This silence reflected not just prudent calculation, but fundamental transformation in how spiritual leaders understood their relationship to secular control. Constantine's conversion, following his victory at the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, transformed the empire's spiritual landscape more dramatically than any event since the original conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean. Having received divine aid from this new god, Constantine possessed both practical reasons for supporting the winning side and genuine conviction that this deity offered superior protection for his ventures. Establishing legal frameworks for tolerance in 313 AD, the Edict of Milan initially seemed to promise continued survival for ancient cults, alongside the increasingly dominant movement. Yet this apparent even-handedness concealed fundamental changes in how governmental power approached spiritual questions. No longer merely tolerated, the new creed was actively promoted through patronage, legal privileges, and official endorsement that gradually marginalized competing traditions. Constantine's Council of Nicaea in 325 AD demonstrated his determination to create unity that would strengthen rather than threaten his control. While convened to resolve theological disputes, reflecting growing pains within rapidly expanding groups, the emperor's involvement in ecclesiastical decisions established precedents for governmental control over doctrine that would influence church-state relationships for centuries. Gradual decline characterized the Holy Precinct during the 4th century, reflecting not dramatic persecution, but steady erosion of cultural conditions that had sustained ancient practices for nearly a millennium. Wealthy patrons increasingly directed their donations toward projects serving the new movement, while educated elites found intellectual satisfaction in theological debates rather than philosophical inquiries about divine communication through natural phenomena. Julian's brief reign from 361 to 363 AD brought the last systematic attempt to restore ancestral practices to their former prominence within culture. This philosopher-emperor, educated in the new doctrine, but convinced that classical wisdom offered superior approaches to understanding divine truth, launched comprehensive reforms designed to demonstrate the continued vitality of ancient traditions. Personal pilgrimage to the sacred site by Julian represented both genuine spiritual seeking and calculated demonstration that the old gods retained power to guide destiny. His consultation focused on questions about policy and military strategy that revealed sophisticated understanding of how spiritual wisdom could influence practical outcomes. Responses he received encouraged his ambitious plans, while warning about obstacles that would test his determination. Julian's campaign against Persia, undertaken with divine sanction, obtained at the Holy Precinct, ended with his death in battle against forces that seemed to possess supernatural protection. His fall eliminated the last serious attempt to reverse the spiritual transformation that was reshaping Mediterranean civilization, while providing the new movement with evidence that their God would protect his church against any earthly opposition. Systematic implementation of policies designed to eliminate ancient practices from both public and private life characterized Theodosius I's reign. His legal code established frameworks that prohibited pagan sacrifices, closed temples, and transferred their endowments to new institutions. These measures represented not mere change in preference, but coordinated campaign to eradicate spiritual alternatives to orthodoxy. Destruction of Alexandria's Serapeum in 391 AD provided a model for similar actions against other major centers of learning and ancient practice. This systematic demolition of a magnificent complex that had housed one of the ancient world's greatest libraries demonstrated that new leaders were prepared to destroy irreplaceable cultural treasures rather than risk their continued existence providing focal points for revival. Occurring sometime during the 300s and 90s AD, the sacred precinct's final consultation remains uncertain in both date and circumstances. Probably elderly, the woman who provided this last response was perhaps the final representative of traditions stretching back nearly a millennium. Her words, preserved in sources that may have altered their original meaning, allegedly announced the end of the god's voice and the triumph of new doctrine that would reshape human civilization. Tell the king that the fair wrought hall has fallen to the ground. No longer does the god have a hut, nor a laurel that speaks, nor a spring that sings. Even the water of speech is quenched. Whether actually spoken by the last oracle, or composed by authors seeking to dramatize their victory over paganism, these words captured the historical reality of a transformation that ended nearly 1,000 years of continuous divine communication. More profound than any temporary cessation during winter months or periods of upheaval, the silence that followed left behind only empty buildings and scattered stones. Though the chasm still breathed its mysterious vapors, the sacred spring still bubbled with mineral-rich waters, and laurel trees still rustled in mountain winds. The human presence that had interpreted these natural phenomena as divine communication was gone forever, leaving ruins that would puzzle later generations. Continuing to visit the site for decades after official consultations ended, local populations hoped that the ancient voice might somehow resume its guidance for those who maintained devotion to ancestral practices. These pilgrims left small offerings among the ruins, while observing rituals passed down through families that had served the sacred precinct for generations. Gradually, however, even these informal observances faded as new generations embraced changes transforming their world. Writers of the new movement celebrated the site's closure as evidence of their doctrine's superiority over demonic delusions that had previously deceived countless souls. Their accounts emphasized contrasts between ambiguous utterances of pagan oracles and clear teachings of biblical revelation, while portraying ancient women as either fraudulent manipulators or unwitting agents of evil spirits seeking to mislead humanity. Proceeding gradually over several decades, physical destruction of temple buildings occurred as local groups systematically removed usable materials for their own construction projects. Marble columns were incorporated into basilicas, bronze fittings melted down for other purposes, and even foundation stones quarried for new buildings that would serve very different spiritual purposes. Byzantine chroniclers recorded transformation of the sacred precinct into a pilgrimage site dedicated to Prophet Elijah, whose Old Testament confrontation with Baal's prophets provided appropriate symbolism for triumph of true worship over false. This reinterpretation of the location's significance enabled continued visitation while completely altering spiritual meaning that visitors brought to their experience. Archaeological evidence from the site's final period reveals gradual abandonment rather than sudden destruction, suggesting that the end came through economic exhaustion and cultural irrelevance rather than deliberate persecution. Magnificent buildings that had housed the voice of the god slowly crumbled from neglect, while people who had maintained them for centuries dispersed to seek new opportunities in a world that no longer valued their specialized knowledge. Probably dying in obscurity, the last oracle's passing went unrecorded by historians who considered such traditions irrelevant to the new empire reshaping Mediterranean civilization. With her death ended not just an institution, but an entire approach to understanding how divine and human realms could interact through carefully cultivated human sensitivity to supernatural forces operating within natural phenomena. Containing detailed records of consultations spanning nearly a millennium, the great library that had preserved the site's archives was probably destroyed during this final period, either through hostility to pagan texts or simple neglect, as people who might have valued such materials disappeared. These documents, which would have provided invaluable insights into ancient political, social, and spiritual history, vanished forever, along with the traditions they had served. Settling over Parnassus's sacred slopes, silence marked the end of humanity's longest sustained experiment in systematic divine communication. For nearly 1,000 years, the voice from this mountain had guided colonists to new homes, counseled lawmakers about constitutional reforms, advised generals about military strategy, and helped ordinary individuals make decisions that shaped their personal destinies. Its cessation represented not just institutional death, but the close of an entire chapter in human spiritual development. Yet memory of what had been achieved here would continue influencing Western civilization long after the last vapors had risen from the sacred chasm and final words had been spoken by the gods' chosen oracle. Questions that had brought countless pilgrims to this remote mountain site. How should I live? What does the future hold? How can mortals understand divine will? Remained as compelling as ever, though future generations would seek answers through very different means.